Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's members' lecture by Jane Marriott OBE, who is the director of JICTU, the Joint International Counter-Terrorism Unit. It's joint between the Home Office and the Foreign Office. And Jane will be talking to us this afternoon on the topic of promoting global best practice in international counter-terrorism. My name's Andrew Glazard. I'm the Director of the National Security and Resilience Group here at RUSI. We research counter-terrorism, but also CVE, which in UK language is prevent, organised crime, and some other topics. I have the pleasure of being the chair for this session, but the main star of the show, as it were, is Jane herself, who will be speaking to us with some prepared remarks, which, as is usual at these events, the remarks will be on the record, but the subsequent Q&A will be off the record. So you will have seen from Jane's very impressive biography that she is a career diplomat with the FCO, has completed a number of extremely challenging postings, including in Iraq, for which she was awarded an OBE, and more recently was Her Majesty's Ambassador in Sana'a in Yemen. But as director of JICTU, that's really what we're looking to hear from Jane to discuss this afternoon. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Would you like me to...
It's entirely up to you.
Podium. Then I can see people over here as well. Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with you all today. Looking around the room, I can see some familiar faces, an awful lot of experts and people who've been kicking around the counter-terrorism world much longer than I have. Although every time I say that to people, they remind me that sort of one of my earliest jobs was in Iraq and then Afghanistan, and all the jobs that I didn't necessarily think of as counter-terrorism at the time, but actually do link very relatedly when you're talking about things like state building, community cohesion, and economic stability. But I wanted to start off today's talk by looking a bit at the global threats today. None of this should be a surprise. If it is, then let me know, but I hope to make it interesting. And then I'll set out some general thoughts on international best practice before moving to some of the specifics. Now, there's a very cyclical nature, in my view, to forms of terrorism, and the aim of the counter-terrorist community, of many of those in the room here today, of my team, the Joint International Counter-Terrorism Unit, and others across government, is to try and understand and get ahead of that cycle. The rising threat from Al-Qaeda dominated the late 1990s CT community discussions, and yet it wasn't until 2001 that Al-Qaeda entered the consciousness of the average Westerner. Likewise, the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011 laid that seemingly declining chapter to rest. Indeed, the Global Terrorism Database listed an average of 5,000 terrorist incidents per year from 2008 to 2011. The places who were suffering from these attacks most definitely felt that they were there, but those of us sitting relatively pretty in the West did not feel particularly under threat. But then the number of incidents and fatalities began to creep up, primarily as a result of the civil war in Syria. And in 2014, Daesh announced the formation of its caliphate, and 2014, 2015, each saw around 15,000 terrorist incidents globally. And for those of you who are like geeks like me, like your data sources, those are also global terrorism database figures, some of which were obviously happening in Europe. So terrorism felt back on the global radar and in Western consciousness in a way that it hadn't been on the public radar, but may have been, and I hope was in the minds of the sorts of people sitting around this room today. What I'm not going to focus on, because we only have 20-25 minutes for this, is state-sponsored terrorism, far-right terrorism, cyber terrorism, specific groups that are not part of Daesh or Al-Qaeda but are designated organisations, such as the PKK, military wing of Hezbollah, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Haqqani, etc., that would require a couple of hours, and Andrew's told me that that would be trying everyone's patience. But some of the examples of best practice can also be applied across to some of those groups. So, for example, the UK's Channel programme, about a quarter of those who go through that Channel programme are from far right rather than Islamist affiliations. But it's the threat from Daesh that dominates today's agenda, and concerns about the evolution of Daesh and of Al-Qaeda that dominate the thinking about tomorrow. In the UK, the period from 2014 was focused on trying to prevent potential fighters from travelling out to sort of the global jihadi theatre to Iraq and Syria, where they wanted to find their fate and fortune on the battlefield. Through innovative use of online methodology, Daesh sought to persuade individuals and local groups to raise funds, travel to Syria and Iraq, or carry out attacks in their home countries, with degrees of success. But in 2017, Daesh has lost significant battle space. But before we start to get pleased with ourselves about that, before Daesh has even lost its stronghold in Raqqa, it's evolved and evolved again. And the threat has mutated in several ways. First, the ungoverned spaces in Iraq and Syria that will likely to remain relatively benign, if you're a terrorist that is, or part of a terrorist organisation for some time to come. Efforts to stabilise Iraq, therefore, are costly but absolutely vital to prevent a reoccurrence and remutation of the threat. Without a properly inclusive political process, the fundamentals that enable the rise of Daesh will remain. In Syria, the continued civil war provides ample and governed space for the foreseeable future. Secondly, and obviously related to the previous point, those planning external attacks do not need a caliphate. Daesh has, for example, the capabilities and networks to move operatives out of Syria and Iraq undetected into Europe to launch attacks. The most valuable foreign fighters in Daesh's eyes, and there are estimates of 30 to 40,000 non-Iraqi, non-Syrians who've gone to those theatres to fight, the most valuable of those are ones who have Western passports or access to Western tourist sites, venues, or who know their own home territory and conduct attacks there. And whilst Al-Qaeda developed a reputation for complex attack planning, Daesh have been very happy to keep it simple and use equally effective attack methodologies. Thirdly, like Al-Qaeda, Daesh has got the branch and affiliates. Indeed, of course, as we know, many of them simply switch sides, and I look forward to seeing what banner they will be under in a few years' time. And it's a win-win situation for both the branch affiliate and Daesh itself. The branch or affiliate receives funding and reputational kudos for being part of a global struggle, and Daesh in turn looks as though it's a global struggle to a greater extent than it actually is. In the meantime, many of the local grievances that allowed the rise of these local groups and branches in the first place continue largely unaddressed. Fourthly, Daesh has dominated the virtual space in an unprecedented manner. AQAP's Inspire magazine was certainly very influential in its own way, but Daesh has taken this to new extremes, no pun intended. Radicalisation of vulnerable individuals, particularly via online mechanisms, is primarily likely to be spotted to those close to the individual and their community that they live in. Indeed, this is the essence of the sometimes controversial Prevent strand of the UK government's contest strategy. It requires the communities and the authorities to work together for mutual interest. Underpinning all of this, of course, is the quite often successful Daesh narrative. In anticipation of battlefield losses, the then spokesman al-Adnani in May 2016 directed Daesh followers away from the need for a caliphate and towards the country in which they live. Home targets are now another way to find a purpose in life and martyrdom. And as we continue to look at this morphing threat from Daesh and try to predict its next waves, Al-Qaeda continues to play the long game, both with Daesh as a rival organisation and with the countries against which they want to operate. When I was ambassador in Yemen, the threat from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, was never far from our minds. The war in Yemen that rages today may be more prominent in people's minds, but the intent of AQAP is likely unchanged. Of even greater concern is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, And I confess that I now use the slightly lazy shorthand of Al-Qaeda in Syria because they seem to change their name just about every week, while still being essentially aligned or are Al-Qaeda with a vision of global jihad, attacks on the West and Western interests, as well as their role within Syria. And of course, Al-Shabaab and AQIM are still very active. Now, I've barely touched on the size of the threat, but I do want to move on solutions. But before then, I ask you to indulge me in two personal bugbears of mine. Whatever statistics you use, and there are so many sets of statistics out there, it's quite frightening, there are still very low chances that Westerners will be killed in a terrorist attack. It very clearly does happen, and it's horrific when it does, as the Seuss inquest, which closed last month, spelt out in detail. My thoughts are always with those victims and their families of all terrorist attacks. But in terms of raw fatalities, 40,000 people died in road accidents in the UK between 2000 and 2013. So in terms of raw deaths, terrorism is an extremely low proportion in terms of Western, UK, European deaths. But you can't quite compare it in that way, because the whole point of terrorist attacks is the terror they attempt to instill. Terrorist attacks, in a way that road accidents or lawn mowers or bee stings or whatever other sexy headline one sees in the newspapers, terrorist attacks have security impacts, economic impacts, impacts on community cohesion in a way that road accidents and bee stings simply do not, as David Anderson set out when he spoke to Rusi quite recently, I believe. So a fully comprehensive counter-terrorism approach has to take all of these wider factors around community, economy, security into consideration. And there may be differences in the definition about what constitutes a terrorist attack, and there is also limited reliable data on the religious affiliation of those killed, but I think we can safely say that the vast majority of those killed in terrorist attacks are Muslim. And it was, of course, a constant refrain when we saw the coverage in the media of Bataclan compared to some of the attacks in Turkey. One dominated the headlines for days in the UK and in Europe. The other got a few column inches and a follow-up the next day and then pretty much fell off the radar. So those are my two personal bugbears. One, we have to keep terrorism in perspective and look at it from a wider position, not just in terms of raw numbers of death. And secondly, the vast majority of those killed are Muslim. The bugbear being, of course, that is not always the perception. But what does make a good international approach to counter-terrorism? There's an entire industry around that. There's a whole spread of meetings that takes up more time in Whitehall across the globe than we actually have people to staff and manage on a regular occasion. So I'd quite like to start by making a few general points about the international best practice industry. The first is that, as we've seen with Daesh, Al-Qaeda and others, an increased focus on horizontal structures, and I have to say quite good talent management. They're probably better at talent management than we necessarily are in the Foreign Office, I've decided. But they have very good talent management to their new lieutenants. So cutting the head off the Hydra is great if you're in a Hollywood movie. Doesn't work in real life, especially not now. There's been the adaptation and evolution of command structures. So it's just not that simple. The strategic factors are incredibly important. For terrorists to be successful, they need to distort and exploit an ideology, whether that's religious or economic. They draw on conflicts, instability, and perceived or actual injustices. They can work with criminal networks, exploiting everything from the drugs trade to human trafficking to fraudulent passports. They can exploit local fatigue with corruption, bring temporary security and maybe even public services in such a way that the local population may be even willing to tolerate or not rise up against their presence. There are no single factors that draw individuals to extremism or terrorism. I suspect that very few people wake up in the morning and decide out of the blue that their calling is the destruction of whatever their broad definition of non-believers or a different economic model is. The mix of factors continues to be well debated, but while there is a set of ingredients in common, it's not a set recipe. You don't take someone in search of a purpose in life, add a dash of being torn between cultures, perhaps a pinch of criminality in a few cases, and an encounter with someone who seeks to recruit them, and a smattering of ideology. It's a different set of factors, different proportions of different factors for each case. No one size fits all. And likewise, different cultures and societies respond in very different ways, and they need to achieve the same end state in different ways. De-radicalisation, for example, is not a new field, but it is still in its infancy. Some elements of a de-radicalisation centre in the Middle East, for example, may work with a British person who has gone to fight in Iraq, but fundamentally he or she are likely to struggle to relate that to their life experiences in London or elsewhere. As is so often the case, the tools of defence are constantly playing catch-up with the weapons of offence. This is true in the cyber world. Daesh will open new Twitter accounts or switch instant messaging applications to continue to promulgate their views. But we are having impact. To date, the Metropolitan Police's CT referral unit has secured the removal of over 250,000 pieces of terrorist material since 2010. The European Union Internet Referral Unit, which operates in multiple languages, has only been going just over a year and has taken down 15,000 pieces of material. Struggling to, great impact. There's still more out there, but it's making it harder and harder and putting barriers up for Daesh and others to operate. And their responses need to be proportionate. If they are not, if threats are distorted and societies overreact, then the bad guys, and increasingly bad girls, will win. In short, there is no easy one size that fits all, and that is the key to understanding the concept of global best practice in countering terrorism. So having made clear that there is no easy best practice, I'm now going to try and give you some examples. And I'm going to divide this into 5 headings: understanding and anticipating threat, weakening the factors of terrorism, reducing terrorist capability, disrupting attack planning, and mitigating the impact of attacks. Understanding the threat, the current threat, and anticipating future threats is clear. Firstly, you can't find solutions if you don't understand the problem. And the problems, as we've seen, are invariably so complex that solutions are complex as well. When I was in Yemen or Iraq or Afghanistan, we'd quite often try and have conversations that talked about the security factors, the economic factors, and the political factors. And you have conversations, including with sort of presidents and senior people, who would say, well, Jane, if we can just sort out security, then the economy will follow. And you say, that's very nice, Mr. President. I'm not sure it works like that. The politics, the economy, the security, the communities, all of these factors are so interlinked that if you pull the thread on one of them, it can tighten the thread on the others. So how do you incrementally work your way across these pillars, or even how do you describe them so they're not siloed pillars? And I have to say, I'd be a very rich woman if I had money for every time someone went, oh, just sort out the economy, the security. Sort out security, Jane, everything else will be fine. So you can't make progress on any of them in isolation, and progress takes time. We all want solutions today. We're in a society of instant gratification. Solutions to terrorism do not come quickly, they take time. Trying to get ahead of the likely future threats, and I'm going to name my top 3 at the moment, which are Al-Qaeda in Syria, dispersing Daesh attackers, and aviation security, requires even more effort, resource, and strategic thinking, all of things which are in quite short supply in a 24/7 world, but it is incumbent on us to make time to do it properly. The second factor, so the first factor, understanding current and future threat. Second factor, weakening the factors of terrorism. And I've already mentioned some of the elements that are the inherent drivers of radicalisation and terrorism. Obviously, I'm sharing the stage with Andrew, who literally wrote the review on the drivers of violent extremism, so he can answer all of your difficult questions on that. We've touched on identity, the absence of basic service provision and narratives. We've also touched on permissive spaces, both physical, which are kind of old school, but still very relevant, and virtual, the new kid on the block who is adaptive and fast. And governments can play some role in the virtual space, but in many ways, the role of the communication service providers is and will increasingly become absolutely key to making successful steps forward in this direction. And there is a lot more they can do to influence the narrative of those openly murdering and publishing their narratives, whilst taking into account civil liberties concerns that they may have. Taking narrative physically off the internet is one thing, but providing alternatives is vital. There is an awful lot of confusion out there, whether you're a 16-year-old in their bedroom trying to work out what exactly the Quran did say about something and what that means, and is this guy on the internet who's telling you it means this, is he right? Or is it this other thing you just read in your book about Islam? So how do you get out the different messages, understandings, interpretations, and make them accessible? How do you get across the message that Daesh twist the narrative, use text selectively, because you need to do that to counter them? And work is being done in centres from Morocco to the Hidayah Centre in the UAE to Indonesia to try and promulgate some of these alternatives, tailored where appropriate for local audiences. None of them are perfect, and some aspects will always be debated, but they are a very good start indeed. Reducing terrorist capability is the third thing that we need to do. As well as tackling the underlying factors, we also need to think in depth, rationally, and with evidence about how we weaken key terrorist organisations as a whole and over time. Further work, including academic, is needed on this area, so come talk to me if you're doing some work on that. But some current conclusions. We need to be careful about reinforcing narratives of globally connected and all-powerful terrorist organisations. Some parts of Daesh and AQ, including some branches and affiliates, are indeed highly effective. But some, while adopting the name and facade, have far lower capability and capacity and rely very much on local grievances to drive them. Their solutions, therefore, are much more local than they are global. And our response will need to change markedly depending on the aims of that particular group. We have to get this right and tailor our approach in the right way. This approach needs to draw together the wider tools of the international community. Some of this will indeed need to be traditional counter-terrorism work, such as the disruption of key individuals, or the pursue strand, as we call it in government lexicon. But sometimes the most effective responses will be through other measures, such as peace processes, providing alternatives to local youths, or wider political, developmental, and military options. And we also need to take these opportunities, but work with strategic patience. The terrorist threat will continue to be with us, whether that is Daesh, AQ, one of their branches, or a new emerging group. We cannot and we will not win some sort of decisive victory against AQ or Daesh. Instead, we must systematically and gradually weaken key organisations in a number of ways, in terms of the appeal of their message, their access to fighters, weapons technology, and their ability to plan and conduct attacks. These approaches need systematic and long-term global cooperation across a wide range of activities. It is far from simple, but it is what is necessary. Disrupting attack planning, however, will continue. The weakening of terrorist organisations take time, and there are immediate threats to be dealt with in the meantime in the most effective way possible. As many of you are aware, there has been substantial progress on this within the UK over the last decade. In particular, the ever closer integration of our intelligence, investigation and prosecution functions has led to a highly effective system with a strong track record of disrupting threats and preventing attacks on the UK mainland. We work closely with this on key allies such as the US, and we also work with other allies and partners to support them in their attempts to integrate their systems better where possible. In fact, a core part of our approach has to be focused on building international partnerships to increase our shared understanding of the threat, exchange best practice and a common strategic approach, improve data sharing, and strengthen human rights compliance, which is key to our ability to work with others and effectively disrupt threats. These partnerships have been essential to preventing previous attacks in the UK and on UK interests overseas and on our allies' interests overseas, and they are a key future focus for this government. These partnerships need to extend globally and continue to become more strategic and robust across Europe with our European partners, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And finally, the mitigation of attacks. terrorist attacks can and will get through. This is true in the UK. The head of the Security Service, Andrew Parker, spelt that out in an interview last November. It's also true overseas. Different terrorist organisations will target different groups. Some will favour state institutions and security forces, others civilians or a particular subset of civilians such as tourists. And therefore protective security is crucial to try and prevent or mitigate attacks. Of the 61 British nationals killed, UK nationals killed since 2011 in attacks by international terrorist groups, 60 out of the 61 were killed overseas. The murder of 38 people, including 30 British nationals in Sousse, Tunisia in 2015, was the single greatest loss of British life in a terrorist incident since the 7/7 bombings in London. And so the UK works with several countries overseas to help them build capacity, both in the broadest sense, to spot and deal with threats, but also by working in partnership with them to help them build up their crisis management responses, responding to actual terrorist incidents, and dealing with the aftermath. There have been several successful attempts to bring down aeroplanes. Bringing down airplanes seems to remain totemic for certain terrorist groups, most recently for Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Although as I was researching this, I realised that the first act of sabotage of a plane was apparently in 1933. I'm sure there are many spotters out there who already knew that. Key to mitigating attacks is the full implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2309 that was adopted last September, because this resolution brought to the fore the importance of more stringent standards and procedures for airline and airport security as opposed to safety. And full implementation of this resolution needs to move forward, frankly, more quickly than it is doing at the moment globally. The UN will report on this next September, but even that may not be sufficient as the threat continues to evolve and diversify. So a couple of themes in here: the importance of international standards, as we've seen with on the airline, but also one size does not fit all. What works well in one country may not work as well in another, or even in areas within countries, between communities. But sharing how different countries approach the same problem, similar problems, is incredibly powerful. Often the most powerful exchanges are at the technical and practitioner level. So people like me can go along to international conferences and have a very nice time and feel terribly self-important talking about big strategic pictures, but actually what they really want is to talk to the prevent guys or the people who are doing very technical bits of how you do airport security. Those are the people who actually are making the real difference on the front line. But it's not easy always to share best practice. Bilateral exchanges are particularly helpful, particularly if you want to air a bit of dirty laundry and say, look, we think these things work, but to be honest, these things didn't, and you might want to learn from our mistakes, or indeed our mistakes may work well in your country, and can we learn from yours? Those sorts of conversations tend to happen more in bilateral exchanges than in wider fora. The UN and the EU both offer regular meetings and fora for exchanging best practice, including the Foreign Fighters Group that operates out of Brussels. And our work with Europe will obviously continue in the counter-terrorism sphere. While it's certainly meeting heavy, the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, the GCTF, has taken a very practical approach to the sharing of best practice. Its life cycle toolkit, its work on detention, reintegration, the rule of law, foreign fighters and capacity building has been very useful. Likewise, the Global Coalition is very active in thinking through the wider implications. Its group on tackling issues relating to foreign fighters, for example, met in Kuwait last week. And of course, also crucial are experts like many of you, think tank exchanges, and sharing knowledge across fields, not just in specifically narrow CT fields, plays a vital role in sharing best practice. So I'd like to offer two thoughts in conclusion. First of all, I want to repeat the point that threats will be global, national and local, and solutions will be global, national and local. They will not be speedy, they will take time. There are no cookie-cutter templates or one-size-fits-all solutions, so the sharing of best, evolving practice is crucial. Secondly, by definition, terrorism is terrifying. For those caught up in terrorist acts, it is nothing other than utterly horrific. But we also owe it to ourselves to keep the threat from terrorism in proportion. For by keeping it in proportion, we can make more sensible, rational policy. We can work together as communities, be they global, national or local, and we can make the world a safer place from the minuscule minority for the global majority. Thank you.